Okay, ready for this? This is my top 10 list of lesser known science fiction, maybe a little science fantasy in there, uh, novels. So these are not short stories, not collections, usually not collections, not part of a series, usually not part of a series. They're standalone books, and I've restricted myself just a slight bit more in the fact that some of these stories, all of these stories are, each author gets one. So if I find that if I were to do this list any other way, I could possibly fill the entire chart with just 2 authors or 3 authors. But that's not the goal. If an author gets one book on this list, it's my favorite of that author's, and they get no other slots on the list. I have to move on to somebody else. So, for example, I'm very fond of Larry Niven's works, but he gets one slot on this list. The other qualifying factor is I am very fond of Spider Robinson's works, but most of the works that I know Spider Robinson for that I would rank as some of my favorites are short stories in collections. So he's not on this list because he's going to be on a later list with short story collections. So those are the qualifications that I use for making this list. It seems like a whole lot of arbitrary, unnecessary rules, but in the express interest of getting a variety of unusual ones that you've probably never heard of, this is my list of my top 10 lesser known science fiction stories. Starting with one that if you've heard of, I am amazed. It is Slan. And this premise is essentially, it was done in the, I think it was the 40s, copyright 1940. The premise is an engineered race of superhumans with psychic abilities are hunted down by the general human population and the despotic human empire or whatever it is. They're being hunted down. It's very shades of X-Men kind of concept. And I kind of dig it. That's pretty much all I'll say about it because I don't want to ruin it. If you've not read it, I definitely recommend giving it a shot, exploring it, and finding out what more there is to exploring and understanding the story as expressed by the author. So that's one. Number 2 on the list is, I'm trying to make sure I got my list in front of me here. The second one, see if I can get them in right order, because there is no actual, this is not by my favorite to my least favorite or anything like that. They're not in that kind of order. This one feels a little bit like cheating, though, because the book itself is the Book of Skaith. It's a trilogy of books. So this is actually published as individual books and then collected. This is the collected edition. The Hounds of Skaith and the Reavers of Skaith are the sequels to the Ginger Star. And the Ginger Star is a Sword and Planet style science fantasy. This is why I sort of added the caveat of potentially having science fantasy elements to it, is that the Ginger Star is a dying world story. It's by Lee Brackett. I'll give you the chance to do some research on who that is, but if you're a fan of science fiction and science fantasy, you'll know the name, or you should know the name, so I'll give you the chance to go look that up and come back for more stories here. But the character in this is Eric John Stark, and in this sort of Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, John Carter of Mars tradition, it's a very Sword and Planet sort of story of a hero on an interplanetary adventure to solve some problem. But the world he lands on is the world of underneath the Ginger Star, which is a dying world, and it's sort of Mad Maxy, which is weird because it was written in a time where sort of the Buck Rogers trend existed more. And so it's interesting to see the dying world style story take a little bit of root in this science fiction setting. Um, the other thing I'll say is the lead character, Eric John Stark, was sort of Tarzan, sort of Buck Rogers. He was a kid on a colony where his parents died. On the planet Mercury, a colony on planet Mercury where his parents died, and he was raised by the Aboriginal people on Mercury. And as somebody who grew up on the planet Mercury, he was exposed to enough sunlight that his skin is dark. So he's a person of color, sort of. He's not, despite what the covers of these books will oftentimes display him as a blonde-haired, pale-skinned individual, he's listed and described in the story as a dark-skinned individual. Let's go with that and move on. Because we got a list here, and we're already 6 minutes in, and the last time I did this, it was 20 minutes long. Almost 30 minutes long. So the third book on my list is my Larry Niven pick for the list. And it's one of my first introductions to Larry Niven. I found a copy of this at the local library, and it's called Integral Trees. And it's one of the most unique setting descriptions I've ever heard of. It's a near zero gravity free fall environment, with the equivalent of gravity being the wind pressure, as the giant trees that run like spokes around a spinning star, with a ring of atmosphere around the star that the trees grow inside of. People live on these giant trees, and the wind pressure is the equivalent of their gravity. So it's super creative. It's a setting that's so different from anything else that I instantly fell in love with it. An author who can write like that about unusual and unique creative settings and build premise within the setting that's worth exploring. Totally worth it. Definitely check it out. So that was my first introduction to Larry Niven, and it remains one of my favorites of his work. So my next one on the list is, I'll pull up the image here off to the side. The Rowan by Anne McCaffrey. This is another one that borders on science fantasy, but this is this shares a little bit with the Eric John Stark from the Book of Skaith / the Ginger Star. The main character is a character known as the Rowan. She was part of a family who grew up on a mining colony where there was a major catastrophe that killed off everybody in the colony, and she was left trapped. And she was found because she was radiating such psychic powers that she was able to call out to other people who were sensitive, and everybody heard the sound of a crying children anywhere on the planet and some places off the planet. So this child is super psychically powerful, and she's sort of rescued because she's crying out psychically for help, and she's brought up to be a psychic for, what is it they call, the Alliance Telepath and Telekinetic, AT&T. It's the equivalent of, they build up towers. They're like a guild of psychics who build towers that help them move objects faster than light to other systems, transport and transmit data, communications, and ships through use of augmented telepathic. You can see in the image the things she's got her hands on are technologically augmenting her strong psychic abilities to move things through space. And it's a creative approach to the idea of a psychic guild or a Psy-Corps kind of concept. But it's sort of like a freelance guild, or like, it has some hallmarks of Dune's steersmen, the ones who control the travel through space, the Spacing Guild. So it's got some of that kind of concept, but it's very interesting. I don't know how else to describe it. It's the description of somebody with great power in a universe who has great value for that power, and growing up as a privileged individual in a society that, you know, ideally you're going to grow up to be able to examine your own capabilities as a person. But this is a person who, from a very early age, was set on a course where she has to use her abilities because she's so powerful that she can't live an ordinary life because of her extraordinary abilities. And it's an interesting exploration of some of those concepts. So I recommend that one. It's part of the Hive and Tower series, which is a several novels, but as a standalone, it works as the beginning of it. And most of the books in the series stand alone pretty well, at least the first three. So you could read them out of order, but I recommend starting with this one, and you can finish with this one. You don't have to go any further than this one if you don't want to. But it's definitely something I would recommend. The next one I recommend on my list here is Neal Stephenson, The Diamond Age, a young lady's illustrated primer. This one, it's cyberpunk, but it's also steampunk with the neo-Victorians, and it's got a interactive digital book that guides a young girl through a cyberpunk future. The book was meant for a young daughter for a very rich person, but falls into the hands of a sort of orphan, sort of street urchin girl who ran away at a young age because of the horrible living conditions she was caught in. It's a very interesting, I think part of the reason I love it so much is it's the world that it's built in isn't uniformly one thing. It's not a one flavor world. You've got the neo-Victorian steampunk setting. You've got the cyberpunk setting. You've got the there's a couple other things going on in the background. It's somewhat suggested to be sort of a sequel to Snow Crash, because supposedly some characters appear in this that were connected to it. But I don't know if I buy that one. I think that's a bit of a reach. It's fan theory. But this one is a worthwhile exploration of the idea of a technological and culturally distinctive future that we don't see as much portrayal in writing as we probably could. Okay, and then the next one on my list. This one's a heartbreaker for me. Flowers for Algernon. The first time I became aware of this one was as the short story as part of a reading assignment in high school. But this one broke me. Basically, you start with an intellectually disabled individual who's part of an experiment that was first done on a mouse named Algernon. And the mouse was increased in intelligence. So, shades of Planet of the Apes here, or Pinky and the Brain, depending on your generation. They intellectually augmented a mouse, and they use that technology to augment this intellectually disabled adult human. And the reason it's called Flowers for Algernon is a little bit of a spoilers. The mouse ends up dying at a certain point. And so the technology that makes this possible has some instabilities. And so it's like, it's an interesting portrayal of what intellectual disability is treated like and is seen as versus how people are treated differently when their abilities are changed over time. It's It can be a little bit soul crushing, to be honest. So this haunts me to this day. I've read it a couple times, and it'll always wreck my mood for a couple weeks at least. So be warned. But it is definitely something you should explore and at least give a shot at. If you don't want to do the whole book, there's the short story version of it. Um, but I recommend everybody at least give it a chance because it's thought provoking, and I think that's one of the important things for me in any science fiction writing is a thought provoking story. And this definitely provokes some thought. I'll give it that. Okay, Brainchild. Actually, if we were of a mind to do so, I believe the first time I read this was on this channel years ago. So way back somewhere in the archives of this channel, there is my summation of this book. And frankly, it very easily landed on one of my lists of one of my favorites, lesser known, specifically science fiction books. This is another one of those sort of engineered the perfect human situation stories, but it's not like they're not perfect. There's flaws everywhere in this process. It's a very interesting take, and it discusses some things like climate change and things like that in here. I don't want to spoil it too much, but it really does take a look at what do we mean when we say a perfected or improved human being. I think that's probably where I'm going to have to leave the description of that one so as not to spoil it. It's done, I will say it's done as a investigative journalist or a private investigator style story of a mystery, uncovering a mystery. I think that's about as fair as I can be without spoiling anything else. Okay, so Brainchild. Next one is another physical copy that I have with me here. This one is different. It's called Cuckoos Egg. Cuckoos. I don't know how you pronounce that. But the premise of this one is the vast majority of characters involved in this story are not humans. In fact, there is only one human in this story for the most part of the story. He is a human being raised on an alien world by an alien culture that's done really well as an exploration of what possible other cultural structures might exist within a civilized humanoid population that has no contact with humanity and no connection to human history. It's the human character in this story is raised by this culture from an infant. So he knows no other culture. He knows nothing about human culture. And he's raised by an exceptional member of that society that he's a part of. I would equate it to similar to being raised by a samurai or maybe like a Jedi Knight from a Star Wars setting. Like you're raised by this shogun, high power, but treated with deference because of the danger of wronging or insulting this character. So he's not raised in the most human-like way, and even the rest of the culture that he's growing up to serve or participate in is treated better necessarily than he is as a child. But it's an interesting exploration of a culture in the lead that is not human culture as we know it. So it's definitely worth an exploration. I will say my next one on the list is This one's hard to find because trying to do a search for this one, like I read this years and years ago, and I will say there's some adult aspects to this novel. So this is not necessarily a child-friendly novel. There's some sex scenes involved and some adult concepts involved in this story. Um, it's to a degree that it's some of my least favorite scenes in the book, but the whole premise of the story is reminiscent of Blade Runner, the movies, in that you have a society of people living in a future where they're able to engineer a servant race of beings. In this case, they're animal human hybrid kinds of concepts. So the main character here that you see on the screen is this cat girl. I guess you'd call her a cat girl. I think it's a lynx, a genetic structure, but you have a lot of these not human. There's a little bit of Island of Dr. Moreau involved in this concept as well. But there's sort of cyberpunk technology involved with this. It's a weird one. I will give you that. It's a weird exploration of a different future. There are AI involved. There's some robots involved in some of the scenes. Androids, gynoids. Um, so it's really hard to sum up. It's done as a private investigator style story. It's a Sam Spade kind of character involved in a circumstance in a world where there are different regions of the world where these chimeras, these mixed beings, are starting to see some of their own civil rights activism coming to fruition. But there are other areas of the world where they're owned by other beings. And it's got a little bit of Asimov's I, Robot in there as well, I would say. It's a very interesting mix. And I think that's part of the reason why I like it so much, is it just says, like, I'm going to take the parts of science fiction that I like and I'm going to play with it to make myself a private eye style story. And it works for me to a degree. This is one of the ones that I would say, like, it's on the list because of the parts of it that I find fascinating. It almost wasn't on the list because of the parts that I found kind of annoying or not particularly great. There are a couple other books like that. I would almost say Heinlein's Friday is similar to that. It's messy and complicated by modern standards, but it's such a weird take on the future that I kind of love the boldness to take that weird shot. So that's on the list for that reason. And we're kind of running, we're going to be just as long as the last one. And then next one on the list is Red Mars. This is one of the best examples of a Mars mission I've ever seen in science fiction. It has all the complications of being a human involved, the politics of it, the medical problems, the motivations of individuals involved in these scenarios, the politicization of certain aspects of some of this stuff. It's very realistic, and I know it has a couple sequels. I think I can't remember what order they go in, but it's like Blue Mars and then Green Mars, I think. And it's about the terraforming of Mars. But I never read the other two, and I didn't feel the need to. This one stands alone. This one stands alone well enough on its own that you don't need to go through the other two. It's about a mission to Mars, like the mission to the moon, but because Mars is further away and the complications of getting people there, and they're having to be there longer because of the complications of getting to and from Mars, And there's a little bit of a mystery involved in the sense that something goes wrong and they have to try to figure out what it is. But there are also tail end bits of story about finding traces of existing life in the past of Mars. It's kind of interesting. It's not as wildly creative as some of the others on this list, but I think that's what makes this make it onto the list. Is it's not about being wildly creative, it's about being astoundingly real feeling. Like I can see this being how the first trip to Mars goes for a group of explorers on Mars. I can see some of the dialogue as it happens in the story being mirrored in how it actually goes down when humanity does it. So if you want to look at the future of what it would look like for a Mars mission, this feels as close to that as I can imagine. Um, so that's sort of where my list is. Yep, we're right at the same length we did last time. Get me rambling about my favorite lesser known science fiction novels, and that's what you get, I guess. So that's my list of my top 10 lesser known science fiction novels. I recommend you try those out. I think the next thing you're going to see from me is a list of my top 10 fantasy movies, and then my science fiction movies, and then I might do collections of short stories. I don't know what order we will do this in. You tell me what order you want to see this in. I will probably do the movies next because by the time this goes up, you're not going to be able to give me feedback in the sequence of events that I do next. But if you have any particular category of things you want to see, let me know and I'll try to adjust my scheduling and planning and recording for that feedback. All right. I think I'll call it here because we're at 27 minutes just like we were last time. All right. See you around. Happy reading.